The Appalachians learned his name before the state ever did. They learned it the way mountains learn anything, slowly, by pressure, by listening to the dark. In the summer of 1963, when the rain fell hard enough to peel the skin from the hills, a landslide cut open a ridge above Briar Hollow and spat out a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Its pages were swollen and ink-bled, but one name survived the wash, pressed so deep it felt carved rather than written: Clarence Raby. Folks said the book smelled of iron and smoke. Folks said it hummed when you held it, like a struck wire. Clarence had always been quiet in a place that mistrusted silence. He worked the seams until his lungs rasped and came home at dusk with his shoulders pitched forward, as if he were still walking under the mountain. The Rabys had lived in that bend of the creek longer than anyone could remember, their cabin squared from chestnut beams blackened by generations of winters. People remembered their births and their burials, remembered how the family kept to itself and how the dogs never barked at night near their place, as if the dark already knew better. The day the ledger came down, Clarence came up from the mine early. He crossed the creek without using the stones and left red prints on the far bank that didn't fade with the water. He washed his boots in the trough and scrubbed until his knuckles split, then sat on the porch with his hands folded like he was waiting for a verdict. When neighbors asked after the blood, he said only that the mountain takes what it's owed, and the mountain keeps its accounts. That night, the preacher rang the bell long after sundown. It tolled once, then again, the sound rolling off the slopes like a warning shot. He gathered a handful of men in the chapel and shut the doors, and what he told them stayed locked inside for years. But the shape of it leaked. A word here, a look there. Something about a promise broken. Something about a line that should have ended and didn't. Something about a man who chose to stand against his own blood when the blood asked too much. The Rabys' windows stayed dark for days after that. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and sour, and at odd hours a child cried from somewhere inside the walls, though everyone knew Clarence had no children. When the county doctor drove up, he didn't come back down. His car sat nose-first in the ditch for a week, keys still in the ignition, until the storm came and took the road with it. When the rain finally stopped, men went hunting and found tracks where no tracks should be, bare feet circling the cabin, then vanishing at the threshold. They found a grave behind the churchyard turned fresh and empty, its stone listing as if ashamed. They found ashes in the Raby yard that used to be a Bible, except for one page saved from the fire, folded and tucked into Clarence's shirt like a talisman. No one asked him what it said. No one wanted to know which words he'd spared. On the third day of the storm, lightning split the ridge above Briar Hollow and lit the cabin clear as noon. Those who saw it swore Clarence stood in the doorway, rain slicking his hair to his skull, his face set with the calm of a man who has finished his arguing. They swore the mountain answered him, a low sound like a door closing somewhere deep underground. By the time the state came asking, the holler had already decided what it would remember and what it would forget. Papers were stamped. Statements were signed. The ledger was sealed away. But the name stayed loose, floating from mouth to mouth, and the hills kept listening. In the Appalachians, blood runs true until someone dares to dam it, and when they do, the water finds another way. The landslide came down in the early hours, when the holler was still half asleep and the mountains were breathing out fog like a long-held secret. Weeks of rain had loosened the ridge above Briar Hollow, soaking the roots, softening the shale, until gravity finally remembered its work. Earth slid with a sound like fabric tearing, carrying stones, trees, and decades of quiet downhill. When daylight returned, it revealed a raw scar across the slope, as if the mountain had been flayed, and among the debris lay something that did not belong to soil or bone. Half buried in mud and crushed leaves was a ledger wrapped in oilcloth, the fabric split along the seam as if cut deliberately rather than torn by chance. No one could say who touched it first. Stories differed even then. Some claimed a boy hunting salamanders found it and dropped it when the pages seemed to breathe. Others swore an old woman digging for ginseng felt it humming under her fingers before she ever saw it. What mattered was that the ledger did not look like it had traveled far, as though the mountain had been keeping it close, pressed against its chest, waiting for the right moment to give it back. The oilcloth was stained dark with age, and when it was peeled away, the smell that rose was sharp and metallic, mixed with damp paper and smoke, a scent that stirred unease without offering a clear reason. The pages inside were warped and swollen, their edges feathered from water, ink running into bruised shadows. Names appeared and vanished in the bleeding script, dates dissolved into smudges, whole entries erased by time or design. Yet one name endured with unsettling clarity. Clarence Raby. It was written again and again, not neatly, but with pressure, each letter biting deep into the paper, as if whoever wrote it needed to be certain the page would remember even if the writer could not. Some of the letters had torn the fibers beneath, leaving grooves you could feel with your thumb. People said the ledger should have fallen apart the moment it was exposed, but it held, stubborn as a grudge. When it was passed hand to hand, the air seemed to thicken, conversations faltering as if words themselves had grown cautious. A few noticed that the pages were numbered out of sequence, that certain sections were missing entirely, cut away cleanly rather than lost to rot. Others claimed that when the book was closed, it never lay flat, one corner always lifting, as though pointing back toward the ridge it had come from. By nightfall, the ledger had already begun to work on the hollow. Whispers traveled faster than facts, tying Clarence Raby's name to old rumors, to half-remembered warnings about the family and the land they occupied. The mountains had given up a record that was never meant to be read aloud, and in doing so, they marked the moment when something long buried decided it was time to be seen, time to be answered, time to drag a single name out of the dark and set it trembling in the open air, waiting for the consequences it had been keeping company with for years, waiting for Clarence Raby himself to realize that the past had finally learned how to climb back into the light. The confession began after midnight, when the chapel was dark except for a single lantern swinging slightly from a nail, casting long shadows that bent the walls into unfamiliar shapes. The preacher rang the bell once, then again, not the call for Sunday worship but the signal he used only in emergencies, the kind that could not wait for daylight. A small group of men came quietly, boots crunching gravel, hats in hand, each one sensing that whatever was about to be spoken would change how they looked at the hollow forever. The doors were shut and barred, not to keep anyone out, but to make certain what was said did not wander off too easily into the night. The preacher's voice trembled when he began, not with fear of the men before him, but with the weight of something he had carried too long. He spoke of history that never made it into records, of understandings older than deeds and surveys, passed mouth to ear in the mountains where paper meant little. He said the land around Briar Hollow was not just claimed but promised, bound by a covenant made generations earlier when the Rabys first settled there. It was not a holy promise in the way Scripture described, but something rougher and older, shaped by hunger, survival, and the belief that blood could bargain with the earth itself. According to the preacher, the covenant demanded balance. For every taking, something had to be given back, not in coin or labor, but in lineage. The Rabys, it was said, agreed to let their bloodline follow a strict path, marriages chosen carefully, children counted and constrained, so the land would not be angered by excess or defiance. Prosperity would come, but only so long as the family remembered its limits. The preacher admitted he had heard the story as a boy and dismissed it as mountain superstition, a way to scare children into obedience, until he grew older and began to notice patterns that were harder to ignore. He spoke of years when crops thrived against all reason, of mines that stayed open when others collapsed, of accidents that spared Raby men while taking others. He spoke, too, of quiet corrections when rules were bent, of illnesses that came suddenly, of babies who never drew breath, of marriages that ended in ruin without explanation. The covenant, he suggested, was not mercy but order, and order demanded compliance. What chilled the room was his belief that Clarence Raby had crossed a line no one before him dared to touch. The preacher did not say exactly how the covenant was broken, only that it involved blood turned against itself, a refusal to let the past dictate the future. Clarence, he believed, had chosen to defy what his family had upheld for generations, either out of love, desperation, or fury, and in doing so had torn a seam in something that should never have been opened. The landslide, the ledger, the unease creeping through the hollow were not coincidences but symptoms, signs that the mountains had noticed the breach and were beginning to respond, slowly, patiently, the way they always did, waiting to see whether the debt would be repaid or whether it would have to be collected in a harsher way than anyone present was ready to imagine. Clarence Raby came back from the mines before the shift whistle blew, a thing so rare it stopped men mid-sentence when they saw him crossing the yard. The sun was still high, lighting the dust on his shoulders and the coal grit ground into the seams of his hands. He walked with the stiffness of someone carrying more than fatigue, his boots heavy, each step deliberate, as if he were counting them. What caught everyone's eye was the color on his soles, dark and wet, leaving marks on the packed earth that were too red to be mud and too fresh to be old. He did not try to hide it. He did not hurry. At the trough beside the cabin, Clarence set his lunch pail down and bent to his knees. He poured water over his boots again and again, scrubbing with a broken bristle brush until the runoff turned pink, then clear, then pink once more. The skin on his knuckles split and bled, mixing with whatever he was washing away, but he kept at it, jaw locked, eyes fixed on the water as though it might tell him when he was finished. A neighbor called his name from across the fence, half a joke in his voice, asking if the mine had started bleeding coal instead of dust. Clarence did not look up. When he finally straightened, he carried the boots to the porch and set them in the sun to dry, toes pointed outward like they were standing guard. He washed his hands at the pump until the skin shone raw, then folded them together and sat on the step. That was how people found him hours later, still in the same place, shoulders slumped, hands clasped, eyes staring into nothing particular. He looked less like a man resting and more like one waiting for someone else to arrive. Questions came carefully at first. Men who had known Clarence all their lives asked what had happened underground, whether there had been a cave-in, whether someone had been hurt. He answered with a single sentence, repeated each time as if it were the only one he trusted. The mountain takes what it's owed. He said it calmly, without bitterness or pride, like a fact too obvious to argue. When pressed, he added nothing, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any explanation. Rumors filled the space he left empty. Some said there had been a fight in the dark, a disagreement over a claim or a debt, settled where no one would hear. Others whispered about an accident covered up, a body hidden in a place the mine would eventually swallow. A few remembered the preacher's midnight words and felt their stomachs turn, wondering if the blood on Clarence's boots was not a consequence of the mountain's hunger, but of Clarence answering that hunger himself. What unsettled the hollow most was not the blood, but Clarence's refusal to deny it meant something. He did not flee. He did not defend himself. He remained visible, sitting on that porch through dusk and into night, a man who had crossed a line and chosen to stay where everyone could see him, as though daring the world, the law, or the mountains themselves to decide what his silence was worth, as though whatever had happened below ground was only the beginning of a reckoning that could not be scrubbed away no matter how much water he poured over his hands. The first time anyone heard it, they thought it was the wind finding a new way through the boards. The Raby cabin had always made noises after dark, the usual creaks and pops of old timber settling into cold, but this sound was thinner, sharper, cutting through the night instead of blending into it. It came just after midnight, when lamps were low and the hollow was holding its breath. A cry, brief but unmistakable, rose from somewhere inside the cabin, high and wet, the sound of a newborn struggling for air. It lasted only a moment before stopping as suddenly as it began, leaving behind a silence that felt strained, as if it were being forced to behave. By morning, the story had already shifted and grown. Some said they heard it twice. Others claimed it went on for minutes, muffled, like someone had pressed a pillow down hard. What everyone agreed on was that Clarence Raby did not have a child, not that anyone knew of, and that no woman had been seen coming or going from the cabin in months. The windows stayed shuttered, the door closed tight, and when neighbors passed by, they noticed a new padlock on a narrow interior door that had never been locked before, a door that led to a small back room no one could remember being used for anything but storage. The crying returned the next night, and the one after that, never at the same hour, always brief, always ending before anyone worked up the courage to knock. Dogs refused to go near the place after dark, their hackles lifting as if they smelled something wrong on the air. A woman from down the creek swore she saw lamplight flickering behind the shutters long after Clarence's lantern should have burned out, the glow rocking gently, back and forth, like someone pacing with a bundle in their arms. Questions were asked in daylight, cautiously, dressed up as concern. Was Clarence sick? Did he need help? Had a relative come to stay? He answered the door once, just enough to show his face in the crack, eyes sunken, beard grown wild in a matter of days. He said nothing about a baby. He said nothing about the room. He only repeated that things were being handled, that what was inside the house was not meant for outside eyes. The door closed before anyone could argue. The whispers grew uglier, as fear always does when it has no clear shape. Some said the child was not new at all, that it had been hidden for months, kept out of sight because its existence alone was a crime. Others believed the crying was not a child but a reminder, the mountains throwing Clarence's defiance back at him in the only voice that could still break through his silence. When the crying stopped altogether, relief did not follow. Instead, the hollow waited, listening harder than before, because nothing frightened them more than the thought that whatever had been crying in that locked room no longer needed to breathe to be heard. The county doctor arrived in Briar Hollow on a grey morning when the fog sat low enough to brush against a man's knees. He was not from the mountains, and everyone knew it by the way he drove too fast on the narrow road and stepped out of his car already frowning, as if the place itself were inconveniencing him. He carried a leather bag worn soft at the corners and asked direct questions, the kind that left little room for evasions. A child's cry had been reported. A birth unrecorded. He said it plainly, as though naming it would force it into order. Inside the Raby cabin, the air was close and smelled faintly of boiled water and something medicinal struggling to cover something sour beneath. Clarence stood aside and let the doctor pass, his eyes never leaving the man's hands. The back room door was unlocked now, the padlock gone, its imprint still visible on the wood like a bruise. What the doctor saw inside was never fully agreed upon, but he stayed longer than expected, his voice dropping, his movements slowing as though he were recalibrating himself to something he had not anticipated. When he finally emerged, his face had changed, the color drained to a dull, unsettled gray. By afternoon, the doctor was writing. Papers were filled, dates entered, causes listed with clinical precision. He pronounced a death that few believed had happened the way it was written, attributing it to complications, to frailty, to inevitability. Those watching noticed how his hand shook when he signed his name, how he paused before blotting the ink, as if hoping it might fade on its own. He folded the certificate carefully and placed it in his bag, saying only that there was nothing more to be done. What followed unsettled the hollow more than the fossard itself. Instead of leaving immediately, the doctor lingered, pacing the yard, glancing at the ridge, listening when the wind moved through the trees. He asked Clarence questions that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with family, with history, with how long the Rabys had been on that land. Clarence answered little, but what he did say seemed to press on the doctor, each word adding weight to a conscience already bending under it. Near dusk, the doctor finally drove away, his car fishtailing slightly as it took the curve toward the main road. He did not reach it. The next morning, his vehicle was found nose down in a ditch, engine cold, door ajar. There were no skid marks, no signs of struggle, only his bag lying open on the passenger seat, papers missing. Search parties went out, calling his name into the trees until their voices came back thin and distorted, but the mountains gave nothing in return. Without the doctor, the death certificate still surfaced weeks later, filed and stamped as if it had walked itself into the records office. No one could say who delivered it. No one admitted to seeing him again. The official story settled into place, neat and bloodless, but the hollow understood what it meant when a man trained to name the truth chose instead to disguise it, then vanished as if swallowed whole, leaving behind a lie that carried more weight than any body ever could. The grave was found by accident, the way most terrible things in the hollow were. A man tending to a leaning fence behind the churchyard noticed the earth looked wrong, darker than the surrounding soil, freshly turned despite no burial being announced. The headstone at its head bore the Raby name, weathered and old, its dates carved so shallow they were nearly gone, yet the ground beneath it was soft, yielding underfoot. When word spread, a small crowd gathered, standing back at first as if the plot itself might object to being approached. No one remembered a recent funeral there. No one remembered anyone being carried to that spot in years. A shovel was fetched, then another. The men worked quietly, each scrape of metal against dirt sounding louder than it should have in the still air. The earth gave way easily, too easily, like it had been disturbed more than once. As they dug deeper, the smell they expected never came. No rot, no sweet heaviness of decay. When the coffin lid finally appeared, it looked wrong as well, its wood pale, unscarred, the nails bright with little trace of age. Someone muttered that it looked newly built, despite the stone above it claiming otherwise. They pried it open. Inside, there was nothing. No body. No shroud. Not even remnants that time might leave behind. The coffin was clean down to its corners, as if it had been prepared for a purpose that was never fulfilled or had already been undone. For a long moment, no one spoke. The absence felt louder than any discovery could have been, pressing in on them until a few stepped back, crossing themselves without thinking. Questions rose quickly after that, sharp and insistent. Had someone been moved? Had the wrong grave been opened? But the stone matched the plot records, such as they were, and older folks remembered standing there once, long ago, hats in hand, listening to dirt fall. The idea that a body could simply vanish did not sit right, yet neither did any explanation that tried to force logic onto what the mountains seemed determined to keep crooked. Attention turned, inevitably, to Clarence Raby. He was asked directly if he knew anything about it, if someone in his family had been relocated, if the land had shifted the remains downhill as it sometimes did. Clarence listened, face closed, then shook his head once. He said the ground gives back what it's finished with and keeps what it still needs. It was not an answer, but it was all he offered. By evening, the grave had been covered again, the empty coffin sealed and returned to the earth as if pretending otherwise might invite worse trouble. The headstone stood where it always had, but its meaning had changed. It no longer marked where someone rested, only where someone was supposed to be. People avoided looking at it when they passed, afraid that noticing the absence too closely might draw attention to other spaces in the hollow that were quietly, impossibly empty, spaces that suggested the past itself had been rearranged, pulled loose from its proper place, leaving behind a warning that whatever Clarence Raby had set in motion was no longer content to stay buried. The hunting party went out at first light, more out of habit than purpose, men needing something familiar to steady their hands after what had been found in the churchyard. Rifles were slung, dogs leashed, and the woods greeted them with the damp, watchful quiet that follows a restless night. They moved along the ridgeline above the Raby place, scanning the ground for sign the way they always had, eyes trained to read what the forest left behind. It was one of the younger men who noticed the tracks, impressed cleanly into a stretch of soft earth where the rain had not yet dried. They were bare footprints, small and narrow, toes clearly defined, heels pressed deep as if the person carrying them had been heavier than expected. The prints did not wander or overlap the way a child's might, but marched in a careful line, purposeful, unhurried. The men followed them downhill, their conversation thinning as the realization settled that these tracks were too fresh, too precise to belong to memory or imagination. The dogs began to strain at their leashes, not barking, just whining low, ears pinned back as if they would rather be anywhere else. The footprints led straight toward the Raby cabin, cutting across leaf litter, over stones, and through patches of grass that bent but did not break, as though the ground itself were cooperating. When the men reached the yard, they saw something that made several of them stop short. The tracks circled the cabin once, close to the walls, then once again, forming a deliberate loop that suggested inspection rather than aimless wandering. At the front steps, the prints vanished, not fading, not breaking stride, simply ending as if the person had lifted into the air or stepped into something that did not leave marks. After a long moment, one man crouched and ran his fingers over the wood of the threshold. The surface was scuffed and darkened, smeared in a way that did not match mud or ash. The tracks, they realized, had not stopped at the door. They had gone inside. The idea settled over them heavily, because when they turned and looked at the other side of the doorway, there were prints there too, identical in shape and depth, leading back out, circling the cabin in reverse before heading toward the tree line again. The men followed, slower now, every snapped twig sounding like a warning. The trail led them only a short distance into the woods before it ended at the edge of a rocky outcrop, the last print pressed deep into the soil, toes curled slightly, as if in hesitation. Beyond it, there was nothing. No scuff marks. No disturbed leaves. The dogs refused to go any farther, sitting down abruptly, their bodies tense and shaking. They did not go back to the cabin. They did not speak much on the walk home. Each man understood, without saying it aloud, that they had not followed a living thing in any ordinary sense, but something moving between states, something that knew the shape of the Raby home from both sides of its walls. By the time they reached the hollow again, the hunt had turned into a warning, one that said whatever was bound to Clarence Raby's choices was no longer confined to the places it should have stayed, and it was learning how to move freely through doors, thresholds, and lives without leaving a trail anyone could reliably follow. The fire was set just before dawn, when the sky was pale enough to show shapes but not colors, and the world felt suspended between night and morning. Clarence Raby carried the family Bible out to the yard with both hands, holding it as carefully as if it were alive. The book was thick, its leather cover cracked and softened by generations of use, pages swollen from years of damp air and touched by countless fingers. Names, births, marriages, and deaths were written inside in cramped, slanted script, the true record of the Raby bloodline, more trusted than any courthouse ledger. Clarence built the fire himself, stacking the wood neatly, almost reverently, choosing pieces that burned slow and steady. When he struck the match, the flame caught quickly, climbing the kindling with a soft, eager sound. He opened the Bible once, letting it fall to a page near the middle, and for a long moment he only looked at it. Those watching from a distance later said his face showed no anger, only a weary resolve, the expression of a man who had argued with his own history until there was nothing left to say. One by one, he tore pages from the book and fed them to the fire. The paper curled and blackened, ink flaring briefly before dissolving into smoke. As the pages burned, the air filled with the scent of old paper and something sharper beneath it, like hair singed too close to skin. Observers swore they heard sounds within the crackle, not words, but a faint rushing, as though many voices were being released all at once. Clarence worked methodically, never rushing, never hesitating, reducing generations to ash with steady hands. When only a few pages remained, he stopped. From the pile, he selected a single sheet and smoothed it carefully against his palm. He folded it once, then again, creasing it with precision, and tucked it inside his shirt over his heart. No one saw what was written on that page, but its survival felt deliberate, charged with meaning. The rest of the Bible went into the fire whole, cover and spine included, the leather shrinking and splitting as flames consumed it. As the last embers died down, Clarence stood alone in the grey light, smoke clinging to his clothes. Burning a Bible in the hollow was not just an act of defiance, but a declaration that something sacred had failed, or worse, had demanded too much. Some believed he was trying to erase the rules that bound his family, to break the covenant spoken of in whispers. Others feared he was marking himself, setting aside one truth while destroying every other protection he might have had. By saving a single page, Clarence seemed to admit that history could not be entirely undone, only narrowed, focused to one unbearable line. The ashes scattered across the yard, settling into the soil like a second, darker snowfall, and those who watched understood that whatever had been written into the Raby bloodline was now rewritten in fire, with Clarence himself standing as both author and offering, daring the mountains to read what remained and decide whether it was enough or whether the cost of defiance would still be claimed in ways no book could ever record. The storm came without warning, a sudden swell of wind and cloud that swept down the hollow with the force of something long restrained. Rain pelted the earth in sheets, striking trees and tin roofs with relentless rhythm, turning paths into rivers and gullies into torrents. Lightning split the sky, sharp and blinding, and thunder rolled in waves that rattled windows and shook the ground, as if the mountains themselves were arguing with the world below. The hollow became a place of trembling, every shadow stretched and twisted by the flickering light, every sound magnified, leaving little space for certainty or calm. The Raby cabin held against the storm, beams groaning and smoke from the chimney pressed down in thick, black ribbons. Inside, Clarence sat with his hands folded, eyes fixed on the fire that barely burned against the wind's roar. Outside, the rain erased footprints and tracks, washing away any proof of movement, as if the mountains were reclaiming what had been unsettled by human hands. Branches snapped, crashing against the cabin walls, leaving splinters and dents, and water seeped through cracks that had held for decades. Men and women in the hollow listened to the storm from a distance, hearing doors slam and roofs strain, and wondered whether the fury was natural or a judgment made manifest. The lightning illuminated the ridge repeatedly, casting the cabin in harsh, alternating light and shadow. Each flash seemed to reveal something impossible, shapes of people moving just beyond the tree line, faces peering from the mist, hands pressed to windows that had no reflection, as if the storm had awakened the hills themselves to watch. The wind carried strange, intermittent sounds, voices caught in the trees, low moans that blended with the groaning timber so that it was difficult to distinguish storm from life, rain from warning. By the second night, the hollow's residents spoke in whispers, avoiding the open and rarely stepping outside, afraid that being seen or heard might draw the storm's attention, or worse, whatever it had awakened. Inside the cabin, Clarence remained calm, almost eerily so. He moved from window to door, checking the perimeter, listening to the mountains answering each clap of thunder. He seemed to understand the rhythm of the tempest, the way the hills absorbed the wind and returned it in low, vibrating hums that seemed directed at him alone. The fire sputtered, shadows danced against the walls, and the rain pressed against the glass in heavy sheets, yet he did not flinch. Instead, he whispered to the empty room, speaking to the storm as though it were a witness, a participant in something much older than the hollow, something that had long measured debts and remembered promises. By the third day, the rain had stopped, but the hollow was transformed. Trees lay across roads, streams overflowed, and debris filled the yards, yet the cabin remained standing, almost untouched. The neighbors who dared near saw Clarence in the doorway, hair plastered to his skull, eyes dark and unwavering, as if he had negotiated with the tempest and emerged unscathed. And though the storm had passed, the hollow felt changed, as though the mountains themselves had spoken and left a lingering answer, a quiet knowledge that whatever had been tested in those 3 days had left a mark, and that the hills would not forget what had been demanded or what had been delivered. The final testimony came unexpectedly, carried by a man who had watched Clarence Raby from the edges of the hollow for years, keeping notes in a small leather journal that smelled of tobacco and iron. He arrived at the county seat, papers clutched tightly, his hands shaking despite the winter chill. What he recounted was not a neat story, not something the law could file without hesitation, but a sequence of moments, whispers, and observations that, when pieced together, revealed a defiance both deliberate and terrifying. He spoke of choices Clarence had made that went against everything his family had been taught, everything the mountains themselves seemed to expect. It was a tale of refusal, of blood turned against blood, of a man who saw the pattern of obligation and decided he would not follow it, even when the cost was clear. According to the testimony, Clarence had not simply disobeyed his family, he had anticipated the reactions, calculated them, and moved anyway. He burned the Bible that recorded generations of Rabys, knowing which pages to save, knowing which traditions to erase in order to assert his own authority over his line. He hid the child whose cries had echoed through the locked room, not to harm it but to protect it from a pattern of expectation that might have destroyed both it and him. He left tracks in the snow and the mud that circled and recircled his home, confusing those who followed him, marking the boundary between the living and the secrets of the past. Every act was deliberate, each choice weighed against the unspoken covenant the mountains had enforced for generations. The man giving testimony explained that Clarence's defiance was not reckless, though it appeared so to outsiders. It was an intricate dance with danger, a negotiation with consequences both natural and supernatural. When the storm arrived, when graves appeared empty, when blood-marked boots and doors remained locked, all of it had been anticipated. Clarence had accepted that the mountains would notice, that the law would struggle, that neighbors would whisper. He had accepted the cost, understanding that defying blood and tradition came with weight that could crush those who were unprepared. By the time the testimony concluded, the room was silent except for the scratching of the pen as records were made. Clarence Raby's choices had been laid bare, and though the county could file statements and seal documents, the truth of what had happened in Briar Hollow was not something a ledger could contain. The mountains had seen it. The hollow had felt it. The bloodline had been altered, and everyone who had followed the story understood, even if they did not say aloud, that defiance had been exacted at the deepest possible cost. Clarence had stood against generations of expectation, and in doing so, he had changed not only himself, but the shape of the hollow, the path of the Raby family, and the very way the mountains measured the debts of those who dared to resist them.